I hired her to fix my house. That was the whole plan. A contractor, a job, a handshake at the end of it, and a house that no longer leaked in 3 places every time it rained. Simple, clean, the kind of transaction that begins and ends on a schedule and leaves no residue. What I did not plan for was the way she looked at the water-stained ceiling of my kitchen the first morning she arrived and said, without any preamble at all, "You've been living with this?" Not as a question, more like a quiet verdict on a man who had been too busy or too stubborn or too something to pay attention to the slow unraveling of the place he called home. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, not really. But I'll tell you this much. By the time Clara Reeves walked out of my house 6 weeks later, the ceiling was fixed, the pipes were solid, the floors no longer groaned like they were confessing something in the middle of the night. Everything she was hired to fix, she fixed. Everything else, the parts I didn't even know needed fixing, those she left behind without meaning to. And I have been standing in the middle of a very well-repaired house ever since, figuring out what to do about that. My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old, and I manage logistics for a mid-sized distribution company in Millhaven, a town large enough to have a hardware store on every other corner, and small enough that everyone who works at those hardware stores knows your name. I'm not an interesting person on the surface of things. I wake up at 6, I run 3 miles because my doctor told me to, I drink coffee that is too strong and eat breakfast that is not enough, and I go to work where I am reliable and moderately useful. I come home to a house that belonged to my grandfather, a 2-story craftsman on a quiet street with maple trees that drop their leaves in great dramatic sheets every October. The house has good bones, as people say. What it also has is 30 years of deferred maintenance and a previous owner, my grandfather, who believed that if something was still standing, it was still fine. The roof had been patched in 3 places. The kitchen pipes had a pressure problem nobody had investigated. 2 of the downstairs windows had frames so swollen with damp they hadn't opened since the previous decade. And the back porch, which I had always thought of as charming and slightly tilted, was, according to the structural inspector I finally hired in September, a liability. I called 5 contractors. 3 didn't call back. 1 came, looked around, and quoted me a number that made me sit down. The 5th was Clara Reeves, who ran a small renovation business out of a white pickup truck with a logo on the side that said Reeves & Co. in plain black letters. No slogan, no cheerful sun graphic. Just the name and a phone number. She arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:58, 2 minutes early, which I noticed because I was watching from the kitchen window with my too strong coffee, expecting to be kept waiting. She was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected exactly. Someone older, maybe. Someone with more of a foreman's energy. Clara Reeves was 30 years old with shoulder-length dark red hair pulled back in a loose braid, paint-stained canvas work pants, a faded olive green Henley with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and steel-toed boots that had seen serious use. She had a measuring tape clipped to her belt and a pencil tucked behind one ear, and she walked around the outside of my house before she even knocked, examining the foundation line and the porch posts with the unhurried attention of someone who was used to seeing problems other people had learned not to look at. When she finally knocked and I opened the door, she looked at me directly and said, "The porch needs to come off entirely. The 2 left posts have rot below the surface. You can't patch that. No hello, no pleasantry." Just the most important sentence anyone had said to me about that house in the 3 years I had owned it. I said, "Come in." She did. She walked through every room making notes on a small yellow legal pad. She asked me questions in a direct, no-nonsense way that I found immediately comfortable. How long had the roof been patched? Had the kitchen pipes always had that pressure drop? When did I first notice the window frames sticking? She crouched down to look at the floor joists in the basement with a flashlight in her teeth, and came back up with a smudge of dust on her cheek, and the kind of focused expression I associate with people who are very good at something and know it. At the end of the walkthrough, she sat at my kitchen table without being invited, and wrote a full itemized estimate on the legal pad, tore it out, and handed it across the table. It was fair. More than fair. I said I'd think about it. She said, "The porch won't get better while you think about it." I hired her that afternoon. She started the following Monday. The first week was demolition and assessment, which is a polite way of saying she and her 1 regular assistant, a quiet young man named Tomas who communicated almost entirely in nods and competent action, tore the back porch off my house in 2 days, and then spent the rest of the week replacing 2 sections of flooring in the upstairs hallway that turned out to be worse than the original inspection suggested. I worked from home those days, which I had not originally planned to do, but the internet was unreliable at the office, and it was, I told myself, more practical. The truth was slightly less practical than that. The truth was that I found myself listening for the sound of her work, the methodical rhythm of it, the way she moved through problems without drama or complaint, assessing, deciding, acting, moving to the next thing. At noon on the second day, she knocked on my office door, which was the room I had converted from what used to be a small study, and said she had a question about the kitchen window situation. I came out and we stood in the kitchen and she showed me the swollen frame and explained 2 options, and I listened and asked a question and she answered it. And then we stood there for a moment in the kitchen in the middle of the day, and it was oddly comfortable, the way standing in your kitchen at noon with someone can be when you are not thinking about what it means. By the end of the first week, I had learned several things about Clara Reeves. She took her coffee black and strong, which I knew because I offered once and she accepted. She did not like being interrupted mid-task, which I knew because I had tried once to ask a question while she was midway through a precision cut, and she had held up one finger without looking at me and finished the cut before answering. She carried 3 pencils and always had one behind her ear. She listened to no music while she worked, no podcast, no radio, nothing. Just the sounds of the house and the tools and her own thinking. She had a scar on her left forearm, a pale diagonal line about 2 inches long that I did not ask about. She said very little that was not directly related to the work, but when she did say something else, it was usually wry and accurate and arrived without warning. On Thursday afternoon, I brought her a glass of water without being asked, and she looked at it and then at me and said, "You're going to hover, aren't you?" I said I wasn't hovering. I was checking on the progress. She said, "People who are checking on the progress don't bring water." I didn't know what to say to that. She drank the water and went back to work. The second week, she started on the kitchen pipes and the roof patches. The kitchen required her to be under the sink for extended periods, which meant that when I came in to make coffee in the mornings, I had to step around a pair of steel-toed boots and a set of legs in canvas work pants sticking out from under the cabinet. I stepped around them. She ignored me. It became a routine in the way things become routines when 2 people are in the same space often enough. I made extra coffee. She didn't comment on this, but she did start arriving with a slightly smaller travel mug than the week before, I noticed. I didn't say anything about it. On Wednesday of the second week, the rain came in hard, and she spent the entire day on the roof in a waterproof jacket I had not seen before, working with a steady focus that I found difficult not to watch from the upstairs window. Tomas passed tools up to her from the ladder. Neither of them seemed to find any of this remarkable. I found it remarkable. When she came down at 5, she was thoroughly soaked despite the jacket, and she stood in my kitchen and looked at the ceiling and said, "You won't see that water stain after the plaster dries." Give it 10 days. Then she drove home in the white pickup truck. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the ceiling for a while after that. The third week something shifted, and I cannot tell you exactly what it was or when. It happened the way gradual things happen, invisibly and all at once. She had started talking more. Not much more. Not in any way that someone watching from outside would have noticed, but in the way that a door that has been closed swings an inch and you feel the change in air pressure. She told me on Monday that the maple trees out front were going to be a problem in another 5 years if nobody trimmed them, and that the root system was probably already working on the foundation drains. She said it the way she said everything, practically, as information. I asked if she knew anyone who did tree work. She said her brother did, that he was good, that she could give me his number. She said the word brother with a particular flatness that I noticed, but did not pursue. On Wednesday, she arrived, and I had already made coffee, and she walked past it without comment, and then stopped and came back and poured a cup and stood at the kitchen counter drinking it while she looked at the notes on her legal pad. This was new. The standing in the kitchen drinking coffee part was new. I made no comment on it. I sat at the kitchen table with my own cup, and we were quiet for about 4 minutes in a way that was not uncomfortable, and I thought, somewhere in the back of my head, in a place I was not fully ready to examine, that this was one of the nicer 4 minutes I had spent in this house. On Friday of the 3rd week, she found the thing behind the wall. She had opened up a section of the living room wall to check the insulation and found, tucked between the studs, a small tin box. She brought it to me without opening it. She held it out in both hands, covered in plaster dust, and said, "Yours, I think." I took it. Inside were 3 things: a photograph of my grandfather as a young man, standing in front of the house when it was new, squinting into summer sun; a folded letter in handwriting I recognized as his, but had never seen in any document I owned; and a brass key with no label. I sat down on the living room floor, right there, in the middle of the work zone with plaster dust everywhere, and I read the letter. Clara did not leave. She didn't crowd me either. She sat down on the floor, about 4 feet away, with her back against the wall, and waited. When I finished reading, I held the letter in my lap for a minute. Then I told her what it said. I don't know why I told her. I hadn't planned to. It said my grandfather had built a workbench in the basement from the wood of a walnut tree that had fallen in a storm the year before I was born, and that he had left it to me specifically, and that the key was to a locked drawer in the workbench that held something he wanted me to have when I was ready. I told all of this to a woman I had known for 3 weeks while sitting on my dusty living room floor. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to go look?" We went to the basement. The workbench was there, beautiful and solid in a way that the rest of the house in its worn-down state had not prepared me for. The key fit. In the drawer was my grandfather's watch, the one I had seen on his wrist every day of my childhood, and then never seen again after he died. I stood at the workbench, holding it for a long time. Clara stood beside me and did not say anything, and did not leave, and I was more grateful for the second part than I would have known how to explain. That evening, she stayed later than usual. It started because I asked about the insulation in the wall she had opened, and she answered, and then we were talking about the house, and then we were talking about my grandfather, and then we were sitting in the kitchen with the leftover. Coffee reheated, and it was 7 in the evening, and neither of us had noticed. She told me she had gotten into renovation work because she and her father had rebuilt an old farmhouse when she was in high school, the 2 of them, over 3 summers, and that it was the best thing she had ever done with her hands. She said she had gone to college for architecture and lasted 2 years before she realized she did not want to design buildings that other people built. She wanted to build things herself. She said this without apology or regret, the way people talk about decisions they made from the correct place inside themselves and have never questioned. I asked about her brother, the one who did tree work, and the flatness came back into her voice for a moment, and she said they hadn't spoken in about 8 months, that there had been something with a family property and it had gone wrong, and that she was still working out what to do about it. I did not push. She changed the subject to the window frames, and we talked about that instead, and she left at 7:30, and I sat at the kitchen table after her truck pulled away and thought about the fact that I had just had the most real conversation I could remember having in some time, about nothing in particular, in a kitchen full of renovation dust, with someone who came to fix my pipes. The 4th week was the windows and the porch rebuild. The windows were careful, exacting work that she did alone, Tomas having moved to another job, while the materials for the porch were still on order. I watched her work more directly that week, because there was less reason not to. She moved with an efficiency that was also somehow unhurried. She didn't waste motion. She didn't second-guess cuts. She measured twice with the kind of automatic patience that comes from years of knowing what happens when you don't, and then she acted. On Tuesday afternoon, she was fitting the second window frame, and she was up on a small stepladder, and she reached for a tool on the sill, and it slipped, and I caught it. I was standing closer than I had realized. We were briefly at the same height, her on the ladder, me beside it, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and the tool was between us, and neither of us said anything for approximately 2 seconds that felt longer than 2 seconds. Then she said, "Thanks," and took the tool and went back to the window, and I stepped back, and that was all. But I stood in the hallway afterward with my hand in my pocket, and the clear knowledge that something I had been carefully not thinking about had just moved slightly closer to the surface. That night I called my friend Owen, who had known me since graduate school and had the particular skill of telling me what I did not want to hear in a way I could actually receive it. I told him about the contractor who was fixing my house. I told him she was good at her work, and that we had talked in my kitchen until after 7, and that she had found something behind my wall that had been my grandfather's. Owen listened to all of this, and then said, "And?" I said, "And nothing. I'm just telling you." He said, "Daniel, you called me at 9 on a Tuesday to tell me about your contractor." "You don't call me at 9 on a Tuesday." I didn't have a response to that. He said, "Just don't make it weird." I said I wasn't making anything weird. He said, "Good. Then stop telling yourself a story about not making it weird and just be a normal person." I hung up and went to bed and lay there thinking about the 2 seconds on the ladder and eventually fell asleep. The 5th week, the porch went up. Tomas was back, and a second person whose name I never caught, and the 3 of them worked in a focused unit that Clara led without ever seeming to give orders. She directed by doing, by demonstrating, by positioning herself at the critical point of each task so that the people around her naturally understood what was needed. I watched from the kitchen window more than I should have. The porch was taking shape in a way that was both familiar and completely new, the same footprint as before, but now solid. The posts plumb and true, the boards fitted clean. On Thursday afternoon, Clara came inside to show me a decision point about the railing design, and we stood at the kitchen table with a rough sketch she had made and 2 options laid out, and I chose the simpler one because it matched the original character of the house, and she nodded and said, "That's what I would have chosen." And then she looked up, and we were both looking at the sketch, and I could smell sawdust and something else, something that was just the specific warmth of the space around her, and I thought, very clearly, I am in trouble here. I did not say that. I said, "Great, let's go with that." She went back outside. Friday of the 5th week, she came inside at the end of the day to do the final walkthrough notes, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" She said for the first day, for saying, "You've been living with this the way she had, that it had come out wrong, that it wasn't her business how someone lived in their own house." I said I hadn't taken offense. She said, "I know, but I should have said it differently. I say things directly, and sometimes I'm a step past direct." I said I had noticed. She smiled at that, small and real, the kind of smile that doesn't perform itself. I said I had actually found it refreshing, that most people were too careful about saying what they saw, and that I had spent 3 years not being told the truth about this house, and she had told me the truth in the first 30 seconds. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "This house is good. It was just tired." I said, "I know how that feels." She went still for a moment, and then she said, "Yeah, me too." We stood in the kitchen doorway, and the evening light was coming through the window that now opened easily, the frame no longer swollen, and I thought about saying something and didn't because I was not sure what I would be saying it toward, and she left, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time after. The 6th week was finishing. Touch-up work, paint on the new porch boards, sealing the kitchen floor where she had pulled up and replaced a section of tile. She was winding down, and I felt it in the quality of the hours. The work was becoming complete, and I did not have a plan for what came after. On Wednesday, she was painting the porch railing, and I brought her coffee, and she took it and said, without looking at me, "You've been bringing me coffee every day for 5 weeks." I said I knew. She said, "Why?" I said because it was a reasonable thing to do when someone was working at your house, and it was cold in the mornings. She said, "It isn't cold anymore. It's June." I said I hadn't noticed the temperature change. She put down the paintbrush. She looked at me, and I understood that we had arrived at a moment that had been building for 6 weeks through water stains and pipe fittings and a tin box in a wall and 2 seconds on a ladder, and that this moment was not going to resolve itself on its own. I said, "Clara." She said, "Daniel." I said, "I don't know exactly when this started." She said, "The water you brought on the 2nd day." I said, "That early?" She said, "You brought it without being asked. Nobody brings water without being asked unless they're paying attention." I said I had been paying attention. She said, "I know." I said, "I don't know what to do with that." She said, very quietly, "Yes, you do." And she was right. I did know. I had known for at least 2 weeks and had been organizing the knowledge very carefully in a room in the back of my mind and keeping the door closed. I said, "Would you like to have dinner?" "Not here. Somewhere that isn't a job site." She looked at the coffee in her hand and then at me and said, "Let me finish the railing first." I said, "Of course." She picked up the paintbrush. I went inside. My heart was doing something my cardiologist would have had questions about. We had dinner on Thursday. A small Italian place on the edge of town that I had driven past 100 times and never gone into, because going into places alone had started to feel like something I did not have enough energy for. She came as she was, dark red braid, clean canvas pants, a soft navy shirt I had not seen before. I came as I was, which was someone who had ironed a shirt for the first time in recent memory. We sat in the corner and ordered without looking too long at the menus, the way people do when they are not really thinking about food. She told me about the farmhouse she and her father had rebuilt, in more detail than the first time. About the summer, she was 16, and they had relaid the entire foundation by hand, because her father had read about a technique in a book from 1943 and was determined to try it. She laughed when she told that story, a real laugh, head back slightly, and it was the best thing I had heard in that restaurant or possibly any restaurant. I told her about my grandfather, about how I had not understood until I found the watch, what it meant that he had left me the house specifically, that he had been trying to hand something forward and I had not been ready to receive it until a stranger pulled open a wall and a tin box fell out. She listened the way she always listened, completely. No checking her phone, no glancing at the room, just her eyes on me and that quality of attention that I had first noticed in the kitchen walkthrough and had been trying not to think about ever since. When dinner was over, we walked to our cars and stood in the parking lot in the June evening, and she said, "I finish the job tomorrow." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't usually." I said, "Don't usually what?" She said, "Get dinner with clients." I said, "Is that what this was?" She looked at me. The parking lot was lit by one amber overhead light, and it caught the red in her hair, and she said, "No, that's not what this was." I said, "Good." She said, "Good." We stood there one more moment, and then she said goodnight and got in her truck, and I stood in the parking lot until her headlights turned the corner. She finished the job on Friday. Final walkthrough, all items checked off the list, everything documented on her end and mine. She presented the final invoice at the kitchen table, same way she had presented the original estimate 6 weeks before, torn from the yellow legal pad and slid across to me. I wrote the check. She folded it without looking at the amount. At the door, she shook my hand, which was the most formal thing she had done in 6 weeks, and I understood it was a kind of joke about the formality of endings, a punctuation mark that was also a wink. I said, "Your brother, the tree guy. When you're ready, I'd still like his number." Something moved in her face. She said, "I called him last week." I said, "How'd it go?" She said, "We're having lunch on Sunday. It's a start." I said, "That's a good start." She said, "The maples really do need work." I said, "I'll need a recommendation." She said, "You have my number." And she walked to her truck and drove away, and I stood at my door watching the white pickup until it turned the corner, the same way I had stood in the parking lot the night before. The same way I had stood at the kitchen window on the second week when she worked in the rain, watching something I had not expected and was not sure what to do with, and was no longer trying to convince myself was nothing. She texted that evening, just one line. "The porch looks good." I looked at it for a minute. Then I wrote back, "Come see it sometime, when it's not a job." 3 minutes passed. Then, when? I said, "Saturday." She said, "Saturday." I put my phone down and looked around my house. The good bones and the repaired ceiling and the windows that opened and the floor that no longer groaned and the new porch waiting solid and true in the June evening. And I thought about my grandfather, about the watch in the drawer and the letter and the photograph, about the fact that he had lived in this house for 50 years and known what he was leaving behind. I thought about Clara saying, "This house is good, it was just tired." And I thought about saying, "I know how that feels," and her saying, "Yeah. Me too." I thought about 6 weeks of coffee I brought without being asked, and a tin box in a wall, and 2 seconds on a ladder, and a parking lot in amber light, and the particular way she laughed with her head back. I had hired her to fix my house. She had fixed my house. Everything she was hired to do, she had done, and done well. And I would have known that from the first Tuesday morning when she walked around the outside of my house before she knocked and looked at the foundation with the eyes of someone who was used to seeing what other people had decided not to see. But the part she fixed, without being asked, the part that had been quietly coming apart in a different register, the part that is harder to put on an estimate or a legal pad or an itemized invoice, that part I had not known needed fixing until it was already fixed. Some repairs you don't see until you notice the absence of the problem, until you stand in a house that no longer groans in the night, and a kitchen that doesn't smell of damp, and a porch that will stand for 30 years, and realize that the stillness around you is not the same as the stillness before, that it has a different quality now, something you do not quite have a word for yet, but that feels, in the most careful and honest part of you, like the beginning of something you were not expecting and do not want to walk away from. Saturday came with clear sky and the kind of morning light that makes everything look like it was always going to be fine. I made coffee at 7, strong enough, and I sat on the new porch and waited. At 8:10, a white pickup turned onto my street. Her truck door closed with the same solid sound it always had, and she came up the new porch steps without hesitating, the way she had come up every step of this job without hesitating. And she stopped at the top and looked at the railing and the boards and the posts, and then she looked at me. I had a second mug ready. She took it. She sat down in the other chair I had put out, without asking if she wanted to sit, and without commenting on the chair being there, because that was exactly who she was. And we sat on the porch. I had watched her build and drank our coffee, and the maple trees dropped a few early leaves in the still air, and it was, without any effort at all, one of the easiest mornings I could remember. She said, "The boards are going to weather to gray in a year or two. If you want to keep the color, you'll need to seal them again in spring." I said I would remember that. She said, "I'll remind you." I looked at her. She was looking out at the street, the mug in both hands, completely composed, as if she had not just said the most significant thing she had said since she walked up my porch steps 6 weeks ago and told me the posts were rotten below the surface. "I'll remind you," as if it were already settled. As if the question of whether she would be in a position to remind me of anything, next spring or any other spring, had already been answered somewhere in the conversation we had not yet fully had. I said, "I'd like that." She turned and looked at me then, and the morning light was good and her eyes were very direct, and she said, "I know." And we went back to our coffee and the maple trees and the quiet street and the house behind us that was, at long last, entirely sound. I have thought a lot, in the months since, about what it means to fix something. Clara would tell you, and has told me, that most things people think are broken are not broken. They are just neglected, which is different. Neglected things have good bones underneath. They have structure that was built to last and has lasted through weather and years and the accumulated small inattentions of the people who lived inside them. What they need is not replacement, but attention. Someone willing to look at what is actually there instead of what is easier to see. Someone who will pull back the wall and not flinch at what's inside, who will sit on the floor beside you while you read a letter you didn't know existed, who will tell you the truth about your ceiling in the first 30 seconds, and then show up every morning with a pencil behind her ear and do the work. I was not looking for any of that when I called 5 contractors on a September afternoon, and 4 of them didn't answer or came and quoted me into sitting down. I was looking for someone to fix the pipes and patch the roof and rebuild a porch that had become a liability. I was not looking to be seen clearly by someone, or to sit in my kitchen in the evening talking about things that mattered, or to find a watch in a drawer that my grandfather had saved for me, or to understand, for the first time, that the house I had been living in for 3 years was a letter someone had written me in wood and plaster and walnut, and I had not known how to read it yet. Clara Reeves came to fix my house. She fixed my house. She fixed it carefully and completely, and with a quality of attention that I have since come to understand is simply how she does everything. Every task and every conversation, and every morning on a porch with a second mug of coffee that was already made when she arrived. And the other thing, the part that was not on the invoice, and not on the legal pad, and not in any estimate, that part I will spend a long time being grateful for. in a house that no longer groans, on a porch that will stand for 30 years, next to someone who already knows when the boards will need sealing and has decided, without making any announcement about it, to be there when they do. Some people come into your life with a purpose you can see from a distance. A job, a task, a defined beginning, and a defined end. And you shake hands at the door, and you pay the invoice, and you watch the truck pull away, and you go back inside to your fixed ceiling, and your solid pipes, and your windows that open, and you think, good, that is done. That is resolved. That chapter is complete. And then your phone buzzes with one line, the porch looks good, and you write back, come see it sometime when it's not a job. And she says when, and you say Saturday, and she says Saturday, and Saturday comes with clear sky and a white truck turning onto your street, and everything you thought was done turns out to have been, the whole time, just beginning.